Now, the question is, why today? Why today are we being expected to give back, inverted commas, the Chagos Islands to Mauritius? What's pushing that? What's the policy? What's the politics behind that? Well, it comes as a consequence of 3 rulings which have been made in UN, United Nations courts. And I want to get into those briefly at the moment. But I do want to point out that these rulings that have been made are not binding rulings upon us. They don't demand that we do it. They're simply advisory rulings, matter of opinion rulings, as it were, that we in Britain don't actually have any reason to follow if we don't want to. There's not a country in the world that has to follow UN advisory rulings, even binding rulings at the end of the day. If it's international law, it's really just very much up to the country whether they want to follow it or not. But you certainly have no reason to follow advisory rulings. And it's not just me saying that. Let me bring up this lawyer who's written the best article that's out there on this very fact. This is from Jurist News, and it's written by Professor Elliot Winter from Newcastle University, and this is dated 12th of December 2024, and it's a 3-part series, and the author is the international law professor at Newcastle University, argues that Britain's planned surrender of the strategically vital Chagos Archipelago to Mauritius is legally unnecessary, as none of the international decisions cited as justification are actually binding on the United Kingdom. As the author has previously explained, and this is in part 1 of his 3-part article, this is part 2 that I'm reading from at the moment, the intended surrender of the Chagos would represent a major strategic blow to Western security. Moreover, the plan offers no discernible benefit to the British people or to the Chagosian islanders, many of whom have come out in protest against it. In practice, the UK seems to be making this concession based on fear of negative future court judgment, with the Foreign Secretary opining that a binding judgment against the UK seemed inevitable. However, the source of such a putative future judgment has not been specified. Surely, if any court with the ability to produce such a binding judgment had been available, Mauritius would have already availed itself of that court. And this is important stuff because many of us need to know what's going on here, and this is the definitive article on it. As he says, as Professor Winter says, instead, the legal position of the British government should be based on existing legal circumstances. As this article will show, there is no binding legal judgment compelling the UK to relinquish sovereignty of the Chagos Archipelago. Here's the juice here. The adverse statements rendered by the International Court of Justice, the United Nations General Assembly, and the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea were respectively 1. Non-binding legal advice, 2. Political assertion, and 3. A judgment on the territorial boundary between other states, namely Mauritius and the Maldives. And the result is that the UK is not bound by any of their terms. And he goes in at some length to speak in about this, which I don't need to cover, but we will put the link to that under the description box when we have finished this video. And he concludes down here, he concludes, sovereignty over the Chagos has been the subject of a long dispute between the UK and Mauritius. A narrative is beginning to form that the combination of the International Court of Justice advisory opinion, the UN General Assembly resolution, and the International Law of the Sea Special Chamber decision somehow furnish Mauritius with a solid claim to sovereignty over the island chain. This narrative is flawed. None of the decisions discussed above impose a binding legal obligation on the UK to vacate sovereignty. The ICJ opinion is advisory only. The UN General Assembly resolution is a quote-unquote recommendation, and the International Law of the Sea proceedings did not involve the UK, and therefore do not have the capacity to bind the UK. For the UK to relinquish sovereignty based on a false narrative that lacks the foundation of an unenforceable legal judgment would be an error. There you go, from Professor Elliot Winter, who we have to thank for putting together this three-part series, which explains the law in its entirety and which explains the law very clearly.